702.
You're listening to the best of The Money Show.
The Money Show.
Welcome to the best bits of The Money Show, your weekly digest of what we think are the most interesting, sometimes the funniest, sometimes the silliest parts of The Money Show, but easily the most important parts, the parts that you actually need to share with someone because they're going to have a direct bearing on their life and maybe on your life. Maybe it'll explain something that's happening to you for you to send on a podcast of this of The Money Show to someone who you think needs to hear it. To start, some of the big news stories that piqued our interest from the week that was. First, and perhaps most importantly, our unemployment rate. Still, I'm afraid to say, a disaster. The unemployment rate climbing 0.3 percentage points in the second quarter to 33.2%. Just under a third. We should call it what it is, which is at least a third of people who want to work aren't able to find jobs. Our exporters, facing massive tariffs from the US, they're going to get a 5-year reprieve, sort of, under a government plan. It'll allow firms to work together against competition law, to shoulder shipment costs, intelligence and infrastructure, basically to try and make sure that our firms are able to stay competitive. And Bitcoin, again, approaching record territory as Treasury investors have boosted the crypto market. Tonight we bring you a mixture of stories from the world of money from the week that has been. Your shapeshifter this week was Dr Nimrod Mbele, Managing Director of the Knowledge Anchor Group, someone who has combined knowledge, academia and business, a Master's in Public Policy Development and Administration, a PhD in Corporate Governance in State-Owned Enterprises from the Wits School of Governance. He's also had influential roles at the National Development Agency, the Regenesis Business School, where he was head of local government, the Wits Business School, and Dual Point Holdings. It's a fascinating conversation, and he does not hold back from some of his views about what's going on in our society.
It was quite remarkable, Stephen. As you correctly pointed out, everything changed at the time. We had new political dispensation. That was imminent. We came from, a racially diverse education system. Back then I used to be an A student, but I realized that the standards were completely different when I go to vets. I had to adjust, in the most atrocious way because the gap was just too huge. Everything, we compete with creme de la creme, private schools, so it was quite tough at the time. But, you stay focused. And you don't forget the reason why you were there. You get support from, they had at the time had a very good support system for especially back graduates, because they understood the performance standard or the standards were completely different. So you just have to enroll and avail yourself, irrespective of how uncomfortable it was, because it's a cultural shock. You did very well at some point, and you realize that you are just beyond mediocre.
Sure. You
just need to literally pull yourself up by bootstraps and focus on business at hand.
You came from Decosa.
Yep.
And Decosa itself, if I recall, was the centre of some terrible things happening.
It was burning.
Yeah. And that must have been quite tough. Were you still living there and commuting? Were you on res at Wits or somewhere in the centre of Joburg? Your family would still have been in Decosa, of course?
My family was still in Decosa, but because of the social upheaval, it was not practical.
Yeah.
I had to, I stayed in Hillbrow at SLM residence with friends. Even during recess, I would not dare set foot at home because it was that volatile.
Sure.
And that's how I survived. It was not easy, but here I am.
The community that you came from to get you to Wits when the government really did not help much at the time, that must have been quite something. What kind of school were you at?
Well, I was in an ordinary public school called Landulwazi, and we had a phenomenal teachers. Our principal was very supportive. His name was Potketer, and he understood, the makeup of black people. He understood the makeup of students.
Was he a white person?
He was a white person. And back then we had quite a sizable cohort of white teachers in the township. And most of them were Afrikaans speaking, teachers. And who were just there to offer their services in uplifting, community, in uplifting the quality of education, because they were relatively better off Whether the best, I'm not sure if they were the best, but they were relatively better compared to the teachers that we had at the time. I mean, we didn't have the right maths teachers, we didn't have the right science teachers. The schooling was disrupted from time to time. Literally, you were lucky to go to school for the week.
Yeah.
Because of those disruptions. But we stay focused. We had a very good support system. And the rest is history, as they say.
You were studying politics in the early 90s, right? And I did just one course in politics. I shouldn't tell you this, but it was in 1994. And I remember my poor lecturer having to make it up as she went along because everything was changing, right? You must have been through the same thing. I mean, you never really knew. I mean, how would you describe the South African political system in 1993? I mean, I have no idea.
Well, it was very interesting because, typically every black folk in the main, we either do law and arts. And very few back then were in the faculty like commerce, engineering, that type of stuff. I mean, growing up in a township, politics was ingrained in your system. Social justice was part of your agenda. Transformation was part of your agenda. So you obviously were exposed to Russian politics, European politics, colonialism, and that ideals on how you move away from colonial setups to a post-colonial setup, particularly in the South African context. So it was quite interesting from that end. But I soon realized that I wasn't cut out for politics. In as much as I did very well academically, because I have a very good sense of debates, grasping, divergent views, and aligning my thoughts in a very convincing fashion, I would imagine. But I realized that politics was not my field because
Maybe you're just too good a person.
No, I just don't have patience for I just don't have patience for people who are not authentic. I don't have patience for people who take others for a ride. I have no patience for, spending time in meaningless conversation where we're not going anywhere. Take a decision, stick by it, and let's move. That's why then I decided to go into business.
You went into business. You also did some more education. I don't know if you felt you completed it with the doctorate or if you're still learning. I'm going to come to that in a moment. I was interested to see that you spent some time at the Regenesis Group, and you were the head of local government there. And I can't imagine how you felt driving here tonight through the streets of Joburg. And it's not just potholes, it's water, it's this, it's that. And having an academic and a deeper understanding of local government than almost everybody, I mean, that must be quite a sort of thing.
Yeah, look, I mean, the condition has deteriorated badly, over time, because we failed as a system to pursue meritocracy in terms of appointments of leaders, in terms of providing sufficient incentives. We have allowed the patronage system to take over. We have allowed a system that appreciates mediocrity and that appreciates underperformance. And it's very difficult. We can't even fix potholes. We can't fix street lights. We can't fix litter. And these are not big ticket items. And I often say, the health of any environment starts by cleanliness. The moment you say litter in municipal buildings, then you realize you've got a problem. And you get to administrative issues like unqualified audits. You have disclaimers. So Regenesis back then ran a capacity building program that is meant to try and address those competencies for senior executives within municipalities so that they are on a positive trajectory that adds value to the system which they served. But unfortunately, as we all know, that went further and further down to a point where every other municipality is technically bankrupt. And we've got audit findings that are adverse, and there's no consequences management. AG from time to time brings a whole lot of reports which don't go anywhere because we just don't have a culture of accountability, and impunity has been systematized because patronage has literally, like an albatross around a neck. Perhaps maybe there's an end in sight because political system has changed. Coalition has their own pros and cons, but on the positive side, we're seeing the needle of accountability picking up a little bit.
Sure,
which is positive.
I mean, I had hoped that there would be a lot more accountability because we were moving away from sort of predictable elections, and gosh, I don't see that.
Well, I mean, we're getting there. I mean, it's going to take time because, unfortunately, we have to get to a point where we get the economy right. The focus in any economic development is to getting the economy back on track. Let's fix our SOEs, which have become liabilities. Once you sort up SOEs in terms of legislative frameworks, in terms of competent boards and clear mandates of those SOEs, we more likely to be transition. I'm sure you all know that we've got a National Enterprises Bill, which failed, to materialize purely because it was just cut and paste in so many instances. There was not enough consultation around the ideological posture of these entities, which are meant to create value as opposed to being a drain. So I'm quite optimistic that we are moving towards the right direction.
I'm going to throw you into some controversy now. Okay, I don't know what your answer will be. You pointed out that what happens in councils is patronage, and there's a massive debate going on in society again. It's happening now again for various reasons about black economic empowerment. There are some people who see BEE and patronage and cadre deployment as three different words to describe the same thing. And they are defenders of black economic empowerment. Saki Makazomo was sitting in that chair a couple of months ago, pointing out that without BEE, it would be very hard to imagine black leaders in his position, or very hard to see the economy transform. Where do you sit in that? I mean, is BEE and patronage the same thing?
No, definitely not. Let's understand the principle behind black economic empowerment first. It's about social justice, which invariably speaks about equity. We all understand where we come from as a people. We needed to have a redress mechanism, and BEE was perceived as or conceived as one of those interventions that could lay the political, that could lay the economic landscape. The execution is different. But we must draw a distinction between policy design and implementation. The design is justifiable. The design had to happen for every other country where there's been in the disconnect or inequalities. There have been some form of intervention by the state. How BE was translated into action and how it was implemented, it's something that where we need to focus our energies on.
Professor William Gumede, I'm sure you know him. Yep. I don't know if you've ever managed him. I don't know what he's like to manage. I always find him incredibly thoughtful in public. But I suspect he likes an argument. I hope he does. He suggested, and I see that his view is now quoted in The Economist, where he said that BEE's probably cost us R1 trillion or so, and that's being divided by just 100 people. I have asked him about it informally, and I think there's a bit more nuance to what he's saying. But that is a hard thing to justify if that's anywhere close to true.
Look, I mean, there's an element of truth in the article that he wrote about. I mean, I do know him quite well. He taught me at some point, and we have also shared numerous spaces where we discuss these kinds of issues. There's an element of truth in his posture, because we failed to implement the policy correctly.
Yeah.
If you're going to deploy people who are not qualified, if you're going to ring fence strategic programs or strategic contracts to few elites who have no credibility, who have no history of delivery, who are not qualified. You are going to spend a lot of money. These billions that he's making reference to are going to be wasted because you're not really filtering down wealth. You're concentrating wealth to those that have proximity to power in the main ANC cadres who are still raking it big time with such impunity. But does it mean it was ill-conceived? My answer is still no.
It was Dr Nimrod Mbele speaking about his journey through leadership, governance and strategic development, but also sharing some of his views about our society.
702. The best of the Money Show from this week.
How I make my money. It was the most interesting conversation we've had in quite a while. Lisa Taylor is a color analyst she's actually a colour forecaster. She can tell you which colours are going to be moving a couple of years from now. Really extraordinary. She was also part of the creation of the natural colour system. Did you know that colours come with numbers? Did you know that 10 million colours exist, that women can see 10 million of them, and men, me, myself and I, we can only see 7 million colours? Did you know that? Lisa Taylor knows that. She'll tell you how she's made money from it.
A lot of artists are said to have synesthesia. There's a lot of musicians. The colour and music is related as well. Music is chords and harmony, as is colour measurement.
So you knew you had the sense.
Yes.
You, I presume, had to go through school. I imagine your colouring in was a lot better than mine. What did you do?
I never coloured in the lines.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
No. Definite ADHD.
Okay. So you have this, I don't know, do you see it as a gift?
Most times I see it as a gift. Sometimes it's not so much.
Yeah,
because colour is kind of overwhelming unless you learn to switch it off or filter it out.
So how do you then develop? I'm sorry to interrupt. How do you then develop an interest in it? I mean, do you study art? Do you do something else? Do you just start to make a living? Where do you go from school is what I'm asking.
Well, I went from school into architecture. I was the first intake of the Wits Technikon BTech course in architecture, which kind of gives my age away mentioning Wits Technikon and BTech, and qualified. My bursary, I was the last person to get a bursary with Anglo-American, and I worked in architecture, but I tended to job hop because as soon as I learned everything about hospital design or housing design, I would move on to the next practice. And in the 80s, that wasn't such a good thing on your CV. So every 18 months, hopping from job to job, I then decided to go into marketing because I can talk a hind leg of a donkey. Worked first for a steel company, roofing, the major roofing people, and then on to paint, which was awesome because I got to do color. And then I was headhunted by a granite company and spent another 3 years traveling the world with that. But my first love was always coming back to me. And I was hunting then the internet, trying to find out about this ability of mine with color and synesthesia, which I didn't know at that time existed. And I came across the AIC and in turn the CSR in Pretoria, being a member of the AIC. The AIC is the International Colour Association. I went to the metrology laboratory. Boy, that's a difficult word to say. And it was like two people coming together. Yeah, I was this metrologist who's a colour scientist, and me, semi-architect, marketer, and we came together and we literally went, blah, 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 blah. And she said, oh, by the way, we want to make NCS, and she touched the NCS Atlas. We want to make this the national standard because the Defence Force, who holds the heraldry of the country, I don't know whether you know that, that's the whole concept of defending the flag. They own the heraldry. They said our new flag, the 6 colours, the only flag in the world with so many different colours, it's very difficult to reproduce. So we want to make NCS the national standard. I in turn thought, an opportunity for business. I approached NCS, this was 1997, and for the next 2 years, I kept nagging them, saying, please let me be your distributor. And they referred to me as this mad woman from Africa. Eventually in 1999, the MD came out to South Africa, and him and I went around a lot of paint manufacturers, and I started my business. And that's kind of, yeah.
So basically what you were doing is you were categorizing colors, right? So
measuring color.
Okay, so you get white, off-white, cream. I mean, would those be examples of what to me might be white, but to you are 3 different things?
No, what you get is 6 elementary colors, white and black at the top and the bottom, and then the 4 elementary colors of yellow, red, blue, and green. And with those 6 elementary colors, you can actually measure the 10 million colors the human eye can see. And give a value and communicate that across the world.
Can your eye and my eye, despite the fact that I have no understanding of color, I'm married to someone who has a deep understanding of color, and I do feel for her, but do both of our eyes see the same number of colors, even though your brain clearly interacts with it very differently to mine?
We've researched, and yes, we have matched the 10 million colors the human eye can see. We have researched, and every human being sees color the same, given normal color vision. But where the difference comes in is when it goes to the central process of the brain, we don't have equal preference. So we react emotionally differently to the color. And that's the only difference. Why would we need color standards otherwise if we don't see color the same?
So when you
you as a man will only see 7 million colors, and me as the privileged woman see 10 million colors. We are better.
Really? Why is that? Is that a brain difference or an eye difference?
It's to do with the central process of the brain. You as a man were the hunter, so you had to throw the spear in the distance and knock off the antelope. As the woman, I was gathering the berries and looking for the ripe and what was poisonous and what wasn't. So I had to come up with seeing differences in color, whereas you had to see in distance. And that's the only reason. But the woman carries the color defect gene, so we pass it on to our sons.
Sure. I had no idea about any of that. Okay, so
come and do one of my color courses.
Wasted money on me. I just want to go back a little bit. So the 10 million colors, I would imagine coming up with 10 million names for colors might take a little while. So I presume we use a numbering system for this?
Numbering system only. So for instance, a red that I think your glasses that would be defined as S15, 60, red 20% blue. So that gives a value. So that's 15% blackness, 60% chromaticness, and it's red 20% blue.
Okay. You're going to have to explain blackness and chromaticness to me now.
Okay. Blackness is the percentage of how much blackness is in the color, and chromaticness is the resemblance to the 4 elementary colors of either yellow, red, blue, or green.
Okay. And when you see a color with your sort of sense of it, do you know what number it is, or is that asking too much? I mean, that must be asking too much.
Normally, most people, even with training, would still need a standard, would still need an instrument, because we have spectrophotometers, we have color readers, and we have color atlases and standards. But I can, to a certain extent, I'd still have to check myself. It's impossible to have the value and the numbering system in your mind of 10 million colors.
Yeah, no, I think that would be strange.
But it's kind of difficult.
Why does color matter? And I'm really asking about the link that you made at the very beginning about emotion. So I've been into a house or a room and thought, I don't quite like it here. I don't know why. And I've been into another room where it's the same physical size and felt a lot better. My wife has pointed out later, it's because one was a dark shade of brown or something awful. I mean, color really does affect your mood, is the point I'm making.
Well, color is psychology. Because it's created in the psyche, therefore it is psychology. You can manipulate people just by having different colors on your walls. And that's why light is also so important. In the beginning of my business, I actually used to go home halfway through the day to change my outfit so that I would be reflecting where we were in the negotiations. So I'd start off with an orange and then go back to change into a green suit so that I'm now formalizing the contract. It's that important. And I would also make sure that I talk to the MDs PA as I walk in and say, gosh, you've got all these beige walls around you. Do you suffer from a lot of migraines or headaches? And they go, oh, yes, golly, yeah, I really do. And my business card is a red card. And I say, just put this at eye level in front of you and watch your headaches disappear. And then the next time I go in, the receptionist or the PA comes rushing out and grabs me and goes, oh, my God, you're a miracle worker. My headaches are gone. How do you do this? And drags me into everybody's office that I've been wanting to meet, because now I'm somebody that seems to know what they're talking about. And meanwhile, all I've offered her is a little a focus on the beige walls that we have around us. And now, obviously, the popular grey, which is also happening, there's lack of colour, so they're not being stimulated.
And you mentioned red, and we all know that red grabs your attention, but I sometimes feel I'm surrounded by so much red as a result of that. I actually wonder if we can suffer from red exhaustion sometimes. It just loses its power.
Absolutely. We've done research which was presented at a conference in Thailand in 2014, where subjects were put in a red room and then asked when the thermometer was turned down, when they felt cold, and then put in a blue room and asked the same question. And in a red room, they would say, I'm warm, I'm fine, but I'm not entirely happy. In the blue room, they'd be freezing cold in a very short space of time. So there's a big difference in perception. There's also a big difference in the way your heart rate goes up in a red room.
Sure.
You should never have red at a checkout counter, because people will not buy the product. They will go away, because stepping over and making a decision in a red room is not a good idea.
I mean, you mentioned designing hospitals. I would like to think someone who's designing a hospital where recovery and psychology of that is so important, that someone's taking all of this into consideration.
Well, I have produced a whole paper on that, that actually gives architects and hospital designers the all the information on that. Did you know that orange is in fact a pain reliever? People, if you put a orange board at the foot of a bed, people will ask for pain reliever a lot less than they do surrounded with other colours.
Lisa Taylor there, reflecting on her incredible journey as a colour analyst and forecaster.
702. You are listening to The Money Show's Best Bits.
Investment School this week, Vincent Anthonyrajah, the CEO, co-founder of Differential Capital, looking at the real surge we've seen in global markets, why we're seeing so many markets doing so well at the moment, and particularly across our JSE and in the US. He also looked at how long this upward momentum would last and how you manage your investments during this moment.
So, look, the reality is, I think you need to approach each of them separately. Now, if I take the case of South Africa, I think we've had a really interesting mix of companies that have driven this performance. So if I take one of the biggest components of our index, which is the Naspers Process conglomerate, and their underlying holding, which is Tencent, arguably that was quite undervalued over the last 2 years. And it's just continued to deliver very strong sets of results. Despite the headlines about China, the revenue growth coming out of that one big component of our index is really strong. And then also, if you look at it, still today, I mean, if you look at their hard currency revenue growth, I mean, it's in the teens, which is comparable to the big tech company growth in the US. And it's, when I say only, it's only on a price to earnings multiple of around 18. And some would argue it's got more to go. And then also, if you look at our other two components that have driven returns this year, your precious metals, your platinum and gold, that's been a big driver. And it's somewhat linked to what's happening in the US. So just before I go to that, so the records on the JSE aren't really a function of, let's call it the South Africa Inc. story, which I think is probably going to play out, in the near future. But for what we're seeing so far, it hasn't really been our South African stocks that have driven that. Now, if we look forward for South Africa, if a few things start to come right, you can imagine that this record high after record high will continue. Then to briefly jump to the US, Stephen, if you look at it, the earnings growth of the top 10 companies on the S&P 500 continues to be strong, continues to be surprising, and it's the re-rating on those companies, so the market willing to pay more and more for those, that's driving that continued performance. There are question marks, however, about the rest of the S&P 500, where earnings growth and earnings expectations seem to be stalling. So there's some questions there.
Okay, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but in both cases, it seems that it's just a small group of very large companies that are making this happen, as you say, in the S&P, and then here with Naspers. So, in other words, we should not mistake these records on the indices with what's happening with all of the companies. It's really just a few setting the pace, and obviously to add to that, the sort of magnificent seven, the tech shares in the US are like largely responsible for what's happening there. So it is in some ways, is it right to say it's a function of a couple of very successful, very big companies, and it's not an indication of everything else?
Yeah, correct. And at the same time, in the case of South Africa, you've had precious metals, which, if you look at the gold stocks, we all know what's been happening there. There's geopolitical risks that have really ramped up the demand for gold from central banks, from others, and that's driven that sector. So yeah, I think we can say this. It's not a broad-based rally. It really it is concentrated in a few names.
Okay. How interconnected then is the JSE with the US indices? So we don't really have a tech sector like the NASDAQ. Our tech sector kind of is Naspers. I'm being unfair, but you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. But we do also see a level of interconnectedness in how they've done every day sometimes. Not all the time, but often the same thing will affect them. So, it's quite an impossible question to answer, but they're not 100% interconnected. The JSE doesn't follow the US and vice versa. But there is clearly a quite a strong level of interconnectedness. What I'm trying to get to is if the US stopped rising, would the JSE stop rising? And obviously there's answers sometimes yes and sometimes no.
This is the way I would look at it, Stephen, is what the market is pricing in for, let's call it the large tech stocks that everybody, and myself included, believe is going to be driving a material change in human productivity, right? It's the AI revolution, internet technology, etc. Now, increased productivity means a number of things. But when you sort of unpack it, what it means is probably a wealthier US as a result of more profitable companies. But at the same time, this and let me just focus on that for a second. So more profits into the US, better demand for things, and that has a spillover effect into a lot of the countries that South Africa trades with, and that could eventually spill over to us. So, when we think about what we export, be it food, be it the fact that more tourists will arrive in South Africa, and a lot of the countries that we trade with, like Europe and China, they benefit from a stronger U.S. consumer, which is a consumer for the world. But then let's also focus on these tech stocks. What are they going to consume, as they grow? As you use more and more AI, you use more electricity, you use more copper, more minerals, and things like that. So I think there's a more closer link to South Africa and other commodity-linked countries, emerging markets, in that if the broader market, the global equity market, is right about what's happening in the U.S., we could see some direct spillover to demand for the commodities that we mine out of the ground. And then there's an interesting pattern, and I'd credit some of the research I saw from Investec Securities, which showed a very interesting relationship between when South African resource stocks start to do really well, and that's starting to happen. Eventually, that spills over into the South African economy. So if we just think about platinum, which has risen substantially, eventually that should translate into wealth in the platinum regions of our country, and then we could see that filter into the other South African stocks. I don't know if that makes sense, Stephen. So I see sort of two two drivers from the US that could help with what happens in South Africa.
Okay. Is it true? So the personal finance people will tell us, and this sort of gets you into passive investing, and we'll come to that in a moment. Will tell you that if you put money in the stock market for 30 years, it is going to grow. If you just did it over an index, it's going to grow. And the reason for that is that over time, people in societies get richer. So I was reminded when the JC All share crossed 100,000 for the first time, that at one point it had actually just been 100. Now, what is driving that? And is that just because over time economies grow? Yes, there are some that shrink. Zimbabwe is a good example, unfortunately. Venezuela is a good example. But generally speaking, barring massive accidents and wars, economies always grow. And if that's the case, if it was not for artificial intelligence, would we always still be having a record high in the US just because it always grows? And so does ours generally.
Sure. I mean, but let's unpack that for a little bit. I mean, when you say if it wasn't for artificial intelligence, there's a reason why companies' profits grow. And the reason why companies' profits compound in general at a macro level is because throughout time, humanity has found a way to become more and more productive. And the AI is just the latest innovation that we have in that journey of increased productivity. So increased productivity purely means more profits, and that's really what drives, let's call it, overall valuations and returns, because it translates to what dividends you can pay out. And so yes, that is true, that if you've got the broad ingredients for success at a macro level, and you would tend to see productivity gains in that group of companies. But you just need to be careful. I mean, the comments that you made about Zimbabwe and the others, those are pertinent. But also, if you look at economies like China, for a long time, that equity market has actually been a terrible investment. So you go through periods in which that happens, even for large economies, and which is why when you're sort of starting to look at the markets from that way, just make sure that you're not taking any singular bets.
So okay. If companies tend to innovate and humans get better, why do some markets not really grow? I mean, what's happened in China? And I realize that there are probably a million different reasons, and each case will be quite different. Whether it's, it just sometimes we all know we just go through that phase in the economy.
Yeah, so many cases it's geopolitical reasons and let's call it suboptimal policy decisions. But at the same time, at the heart of it, growth and productivity that sometimes comes at the cost of other companies and other industries. So if you think about what's happened in the US, yes, the S&P 500 is up at all-time highs. But I can tell you can find a couple of companies there, not a couple, many actually, whose entire industries have been obliterated by the changes that have been coming through. And I think you also see that from country to country. If you take South Africa in the 1980s, gold mining stocks were a much, much, much bigger proportion of our index. And then they went through a sort of decline, and now they're sort of coming back. But that's what happens. Even when you look at a sectoral level, if you take the South African banks as an example, the success of Capitec has certainly come at the cost of the competitors. And I would say even more so for some of the insurance companies whose lunch has been taken up by them. So I think that's just the nature of it. And so again, going back to my point, just be careful. When you start making sweeping statements that markets tend to go up, just ensure that you're not concentrating yourself in one singular investment theme.
Vincent Anthonyrajah there, speaking about the really interesting surge in market highs across South Africa and the US, and some advice on how to invest in this moment.
702. You are listening to The Money Show's Best Bits.
Your business book review. Bronwyn Williams is the trend translator and future finance specialist at Flux Trends. She is a regular book reviewer, but we spoke to her about her own book. So we spoke to her this week as an author. The title, Survive the AI AI apocalypse, a guide for solutionists. She unpacked how artificial intelligence is reshaping reality from AI-generated news, goodness me, to virtual partners and CEO. Bronwyn Williams, a fascinating conversation about a fascinating book.
Well, we can blame the publisher for the title. I don't know how many of your listeners know it. When you do write a book, both the title and the cover are not exactly the author's final decision, but the content within the book definitely are. So maybe a little bit of the hyperbole has made it through to the cover, but I think the point does stand. And our thesis, well, I've co-wrote this book with one woman called Sharon Pierce, who is a business transformation specialist and has been for many years, is that for a lot of people, this whole thing of AI combined with the forces of globalization, which really means moving into a very, very competitive space, are going to be outright traumatic and might feel a bit apocalyptic to many people who currently are in or trying to get back into the job market.
What do you mean by a solutionist? I mean, I think we all think that we're good at solving problems. I mean, I know for a fact we're all, and I've worked in talk radio for a while, we're all pretty good at talking and complaining about our problems. How would you describe a solutionist? Is it someone who works towards a solution, someone who comes up with solutions?
Well, it's very simple. A solutionist is someone who sees a problem, identifies that problem, and then finds a way to solve that problem. I mean, we're really just talking about the good old thing of like how to start a business, be an entrepreneur. What do? You find a problem, you solve that problem. But what we're trying to say in the book is that it's not just people who currently identify as entrepreneurs, but really everyone, whether you're employed, currently unemployed, whether you run a business, whether you're part of a massive organization. Our thesis is everybody's got to see themselves as a solutionist, because what's happening now with this apocalypse, to use the publisher's term, is that basically there's a reckoning in terms of the value you are bringing to the economy and the price that you are charging. Those two figures have to be aligned, and quite frankly, they're not aligned at the moment. There are many people who add a lot of value, solve a lot of problems, who aren't necessarily being compensated, and on the flip side, the people we're really talking to here are people that think that they add a lot of value to the economy, but maybe really don't. They just take home quite a big paycheck, or think they deserve quite a big paycheck at the moment. And we're basically telling people you need to actually be adding value to whoever is paying you, whether that is a customer, whether that is an employer, whether that is an organization or an individual. Somebody is your customer ultimately. And are you really adding value to that person, or are you really just extracting value from an inefficient market? Because we certainly see that what's happening at the moment with digitization and automation and globalization is that there's a lot of scrutiny on where the fat is sitting on the system and where there are people that are extracting value. And two things that are happening. The one is quite fair, that people who are extracting value and not adding value to society, whether they are overpaid consultants or whether they are overpaid people sitting in HR departments, whatever the case is, they're going to be found out. This is what all these forces are moving towards. But at the same time, the more unfair side of this, the darker side, we don't have a solution for, maybe someone listening does, is that what's happening is that fat in the system is ending up being concentrated in the hands of quite a few or very few individual companies. We know this. This is the case of like wealth accumulating in the top, not 10%, not 1%, but sort of like 0.01% of the market, whether you're looking at organizations or individuals. So as much as automation is destroying a lot of BS, it's also going to create new waves of it. But for us, those of us who are part of the trading class, who have to negotiate in order to justify our paycheck or our place in the market, the pressure is on. The competition is on, and we're going to have to be able to articulate the value that we add and define the problems we are solving very, very carefully. And the solution as part of the book is really a model that Sharon's developed, and I've helped her translate, as that's what I do. Basically a system as to how the people can check whether they are adding value or not, and a few steps that they can take in order to start doing that.
So I think there is a sense, and I think your publisher is using this, there is a sense that literally it's the end of the world as we know it, and I'm supposed to feel fine, but I don't. And what I've seen, because I'm now old enough, is that people will say the world is going to change very quickly, and the world changes quickly and slowly at the same time. And that's a strange thing, but I often notice that people say, all of these jobs are going to be gone in 10 years' time. And actually you find some of those people are still doing very similar things, or they're using the same skill to do something that's almost the same, but there's a different delivery system or something.
Yes, of course, that is part of it. That's where the sort of hyperbole in this whole AI and automation sort of conversation and the globalization migration conversation, which is really part of this competition on landscape that we find ourselves in, it is a part of, right? This idea that all our jobs are under threat and everything's going to change overnight. That's not the case. What's really happening is a concentration, as I said, of value. So for some people, things don't change. For a very few select people, things change very, very well in their favor. But for the most of us, we're going to have to work that a little bit faster, harder, run that a little bit faster on the treadmill in order to justify our place in the economic scheme of things. And this is where it gets really, really hard, in that overall, that whole thing, the world's moving quite slowly, and all those like really scary numbers put out by the World Economic Forum are hyperbole. They are nonsense when they say all these jobs are going to disappear. What is going to happen is these jobs are going to concentrate, and these jobs are going to change. The tasks you do within your job is going to change, but also there's extra chairs being pulled out of the sort of the game of like Ring a Rosie that you're playing, or musical chairs that you're playing, which means that every time that sort of music plays and every single cycle, with a greater concentration of wealth, but a fewer seats at the table. And seats at the table very specifically here being JOB jobs, the salaried output, not so defined, but income very defined, sort of arrangement of work that many of us, particularly in South Africa, understand as being economically independent, right? It's the idea of having a job. But the truth is there's going to be less jobs, and the jobs that are there are going to be concentrating in terms of where those opportunities lie. So, so for most of us, it's going to be a case of more precarious employment, and employment itself is going to shift, and we're going to have to justify our place in the value chain. That's part of the mindset shift we're trying to explain here. It's thinking beyond finding a job and becoming a salary dependent worker in a corporation towards how do I identify myself as kind of like this incorporated individual, which is not something many people want to hear.
Sure.
I'm a trained economist. I know that most people would happily trade a bit of freedom for some security. But what we're saying really is that security is being taken away from the majority of us. And we're going to have to learn how to swim in choppier waters, face more uncertainty, which is something that, of course, I've spent most of my career looking at, uncertainty in futures and all of this. So hopefully the book gives people a bit of perspective on where the nonsense is, where the BS is, and where the truth of the story is, which really is a personal reckoning of you standing in front of the mirror saying, what is the value I add to society? Honestly, not what is the work that I do, not where am I busy, not why am I tired, but actually what is the value that I'm adding here? The good news is all of us have value to add.
That was Bronwyn Williams giving you a look into the future shaped by artificial intelligence. Her book, it's called Survive the AI Apocalypse, a guide for solutionists. I must tell you, I didn't really like the apocalypse part, but I quite liked the survive part of that title.
The best of the Money Show
on 702.
702.
You've been listening to the best bits of the Money Show, a digest of some of the best conversations, some of the best thoughts, best insights, best comments this week. If you'd like to hear more, please go to our website, go to your podcast app and search for The Money Show. Thanks for being with us this week. Back on The Money Show, 6 o'clock on Monday. Have a good weekend.